restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations, the clinking of silverware against porcelain adding a rhythmic backdrop. Dressed in an elegant black dress, Jane exuded confidence as she waited for her friend. Across the room, Pete, a sharp-eyed businessman, observed her with curiosity. To him, appearances spoke volumes, and hers, combined with her poised demeanor, suggested something transactional. Without hesitation, he approached, slipping a crisp $300 bill across the table. "For your time," he said smoothly, as if sealing a business deal.
Hello, I'm the storyteller of the channel, and I would like to ask for a second of your time to subscribe, activate the notification bell, and like the video so that YouTube can take our story to more people who are passionate about stories like this. Thank you, and without further ado, let's continue with our story.
Jane's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sardonic smile. "Wow, that's bold," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I must say, you value people in the most interesting ways." Pete, unfazed, leaned back and studied her reaction. He wasn't used to misjudging situations, but something about her confidence intrigued him. Instead of apologizing, he justified himself. "Time is money," he stated. "I compensate what I consider valuable." His words, though cold, carried a philosophy he lived by. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "Is that how you see the world? People as commodities?" There was no anger in her tone, only amusement, as if she had seen men like him before, driven, calculative, and slightly blind to the nuances of human connection. Pete shrugged, unbothered. "It's simple economics. You don't waste what's valuable. You invest in it." But Jane wasn't one to let assumptions slide so easily. With an effortless grace, she slid the money back toward him. "Well, here's your refund," she said, her gaze locked onto his. "Some things aren't for sale." The challenge in her voice unsettled him. He had expected indignation, maybe even an outburst, but not this. Her calm defiance, her refusal to play into the narrative he had written in his head. Pete felt something unfamiliar stir inside him, a curiosity that refused to be ignored. For a moment, he considered walking away. He had made his offer, and she had declined. End a transaction. But something about her made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way she refused to be defined by his assumption. Or maybe deep down, he knew he had miscalculated. Instead of leaving, he decided to stay. "You have an interesting perspective," he admitted. "I underestimated you." His voice held no arrogance now, only intrigue. Jane smirked. "You wouldn't be the first." She picked up her glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down. "Tell me, do you always put a price tag on things before understanding their worth?" Her words hit harder than he expected. Pete had built his career on calculated risks, measured decisions, and a strict adherence to efficiency. But here, in this unplanned exchange, efficiency had failed him. As the tension hung in the air, Pete found himself at a crossroads. The woman he had assumed to be one thing had turned out to be something entirely different. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of a misstep. Yet, instead of dismissing it, he embraced the unexpected. This wasn't just about a mistaken identity anymore. It was the start of something unpredictable, something uncalculated. And Pete wasn't sure whether to be intrigued or terrified by that realization. The boardroom was a stark contrast to the restaurant's warm ambience. Glass walls, sleek furniture, and the sharp scent of freshly brewed coffee setting the tone for business. Pete sat at the head of the table, his confidence restored, ready to present the contract that could seal one of the biggest deals of his career. Across from him, Miss Toppelbaum, a woman with an almost unsettling ability to read people, observed with quiet scrutiny. The stakes were high, and Pete knew it. But he wasn't alone. His team, including his right-hand man, Pete, was there to support him. As the presentation began, it was clear that Pete had prepared extensively. Every slide, every number, every word was crafted to perfection. But then came his partner, Pete, tasked with delivering a key section of the pitch. The moment he spoke, the air in the room shifted. His voice wavered, his words stumbled, and his hands fumbled with the remote, advancing slides too quickly. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Pete's jaw clenched. He had seen Pete under pressure before, but this was different. Miss Topplebaum's brow arched slightly as she folded her hands on the table, unimpressed. Pete shot a glance at his colleague, silently urging him to regain control. But the damage was already done. The once flawless presentation now had cracks, and Pete could feel Miss Topplebaum's skepticism thickening. She wasn't the kind of woman who overlooked details, and Pete knew she was already reassessing whether this deal was worth the risk. The problem wasn't the contract, it was trust. A single misstep in business could unravel months of work, and Pete wasn't about to let that happen. He smoothly took over, masking the stumble with confident rhetoric, steering the conversation back on track. His words flowed effortlessly, but he could sense that Miss Topplebaum wasn't entirely convinced. Her gaze flicked toward Pete, then back to Pete, her silence speaking volumes. Trust wasn't something easily regained, and she was already weighing her options. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling," she finally said, her voice even but sharp. "Do all of your partners perform this unpredictably?" There was the first sign of doubt verbalized. Pete knew better than to react emotionally. He smiled, measured and composed. "We believe in investing in people, Miss Topplebaum. Sometimes, investment takes patience." His words were carefully chosen, but he could see that she wasn't fully buying it. "Not yet." Miss Topplebaum leaned back, considering. The deal itself was sound, but execution mattered. A lapse in confidence during a pitch could mean a lapse in execution down the line. She wasn't interested in working with companies that couldn't guarantee stability. "I like the contract," she admitted, "but I have concerns." Pete didn't flinch. He had expected this. Negotiation was never just about numbers. It was about perception. As the meeting wrapped up, Pete knew the deal wasn't lost, but it was hanging by a thread. Miss Topplebaum wasn't walking away yet, but she had left the door open for conditions, ones Pete might not be entirely prepared for. And just like that, the tension in the air shifted once more. The conversation wasn't over. It was only beginning. Miss Topplebaum's piercing gaze settled on Pete, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished surface of the table. "I don't make decisions based on instinct," she said, her voice as measured as a well-crafted contract. "I make them based on trust. And right now, I'm not convinced your team can deliver without complications." Pete remained composed, but inside, his mind was already running through potential solutions. She wasn't rejecting the deal outright. She was giving him a chance to fix it. That meant there was still a way forward. She exhaled slowly, as if weighing the words before speaking. "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Sterling. The numbers look good. The proposal is solid. But your partner's performance today? That makes me question if your company is as reliable as you claim." Her words were sharp, but Pete appreciated honesty when he saw it. A weaker negotiator would have walked away, but Miss Topplebaum was testing him, seeing if he would flinch. He wouldn't. "Business isn't just about perfection, Miss Topplebaum." Pete responded smoothly, leaning forward just enough to meet her eyes. "It's about how we handle imperfection. If my partner made an error, that means we now have the opportunity to correct it. And that's exactly what we'll do." He delivered his words with quiet confidence, fully aware that one wrong step could mean losing everything. Pete had seen too many deals slip through his fingers before. This wouldn't be one of them. Miss Topplebaum studied him, unimpressed but not entirely dismissive. "Then prove it," she finally said. "Fix this. Show me that your team can perform under pressure. Because I don't invest in uncertainty." The challenge was clear. Pete didn't just need to salvage the deal. He needed to prove that his team was worth trusting. And for that, Pete had to step up. Failure wasn't an option. Not when so much was on the line. Pete nodded, already forming a plan. He would speak to Pete, find out what had rattled him, and figure out how to ensure it never happened again. There was always a reason behind a slip-up. Fear? Personal issues? A lack of preparation? Whatever it was, Pete needed to address it before it cost him more than just this contract. He couldn't afford to carry dead weight, but he also wasn't the kind of leader who abandoned people at the first sign of trouble. The weight of the conversation lingered as Miss Topplebaum stood up, gathering her papers. "You have 48 hours, she said, her tone final. "Fix this, or we're done here." Then, with a nod, she turned and walked away, leaving Pete with the undeniable feeling that she had just handed him a loaded gun, one he had to use wisely. The countdown had begun. As Pete walked out of the boardroom, his thoughts drifted back to the unexpected encounter from the night before. The woman he had misjudged, the lesson he hadn't yet processed. It wasn't lost on him that, just like that moment, this situation was forcing him to see things differently. And maybe, just maybe, the solution to one problem might hold the answer to another. The evening air was crisp as Pete stepped into the dimly lit lounge, his mind still tangled in the weight of Miss Topplebaum's ultimatum. He needed a distraction. Or maybe, deep down, he was seeking clarity. And somehow, fate had a way of leading him right where he needed to be. Across the room, Jane sat alone, a glass of wine in hand, her presence as poised and unshaken as the night before. He hesitated for a moment before making his way to her table. She glanced up, smirking as he pulled out a chair without waiting for an invitation. "If you're here to offer me another deal, save your breath," she quipped, swirling the wine in her glass. Pete exhaled a small laugh, shaking his head. "No offers tonight, just conversation." Something in his tone made her raise an eyebrow. He wasn't the same man from the night before. He looked unsettled, like someone staring at a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. For a while they just talked, not about business, not about assumptions, just life. And then, in a moment of unexpected honesty, Jane leaned back, watching him closely. "You know, you got me all wrong yesterday," she said. "I don't sell my time. I invest it, and I'm very selective about where it goes." Pete froze, the weight of her words settling in. She wasn't just playing with semantics. She was mirroring his own philosophy back at him, only in a way he hadn't considered before. He blinked, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he had misjudged so quickly. "You're in business?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "And a damn good one, too," she said. "Funny, isn't it? You value efficiency. You believe in maximizing time. Yet, in the span of 5 seconds, you completely miscalculated mine." There was no malice in her tone, just truth. And for the first time in a long time, Pete found himself speechless. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I was wrong." The words felt foreign in his mouth, but freeing. Jane chuckled. "That's a rare phrase, I'm guessing." Pete smirked, but there was no defense left in him. He had spent his life reading people, anticipating their moves, making decisions based on logic and profit. But what if the best investments weren't the ones he could measure in numbers? For the first time, Pete saw himself from a different perspective. He wasn't just the businessman who closed deals. He was the man who overlooked things that didn't fit neatly into his calculations. And Jane? She was proof that not everything valuable had a price tag. It made him wonder, what else had he been missing? As the conversation lingered, Pete felt something shift within him. It wasn't just about the deal anymore. It wasn't just about fixing a mistake. This was something else entirely, something he hadn't planned for. And suddenly, he wasn't sure if that terrified him or thrilled him. The next morning, Pete walked into the office with a different kind of determination. Something about his conversation with Jane had shifted his perspective, forcing him to reassess not just the deal with Miss Topplebaum, but how he approached everything. He had spent years treating negotiations like a battlefield. Win or lose, profit or waste. But now he saw the cracks in that mindset. Success wasn't just about leverage. It was about trust. And if he wanted to salvage this deal, he needed to prove he understood that. Pete wasted no time. He called Pete into his office, shutting the door behind them. "Tell me what happened yesterday," he said, his tone even but firm. Pete hesitated before admitting the truth. He had been distracted, overwhelmed, second-guessing himself. "I wanted to impress you," he finally admitted, voice quieter than usual. "But the pressure got to me?" Pete nodded, processing. For the first time, instead of seeing this as a liability, he saw an opportunity. This wasn't about replacing Pete. It was about making him better. When Pete met Miss Topplebaum again, he did something unexpected. He acknowledged the mistake, openly, without excuses. "Yesterday wasn't our best performance," he admitted. "But the strength of a company isn't in perfection. It's in how we adapt." He presented an updated strategy, one that reassured her that their execution wouldn't falter again. He even let Pete take the lead on part of the discussion, proving his faith in him. And just like that, the tides turned. Miss Topplebaum nodded approvingly. "Now that's what I wanted to see," she said. "A team that knows how to correct its course." The deal was back on, stronger than before. As Pete left the meeting, the relief was undeniable, but there was something else under the surface. His mind kept circling back to Jane, the woman who had challenged his thinking in ways he hadn't expected. Success had always been his priority, but for the first time, he found himself wanting more than just a signed contract. That night, he found himself at the same lounge again, and there she was, as if the universe had orchestrated it. Jane saw him approaching and smirked. "Back so soon? Let me guess. Another transaction?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "No business tonight. Just investing my time wisely." Her eyebrow lifted in amusement, but there was something else in her expression. Curiosity, interest, maybe even something deeper. They sat together, and for the first time, Pete wasn't thinking in terms of profit margins or strategy. He was simply present. As the evening unfolded, Pete realized that sometimes the most unexpected moments led to the most valuable connections. He had come looking for success. Instead, he had found something much rarer, something that couldn't be measured in numbers or contracts. An emotional story that hadn't been written yet. A romance that, for once, he wasn't trying to control. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare him. It thrilled him.